The stagecoach lurched to a violent stop in front of the Loveland, Colorado depot, and Florence Thatcher knew before the driver even climbed down that something was terribly wrong. She pressed her gloved hand against the dusty window, watching as angry passengers from the previous departure surrounded the station master, their voices rising in heated argument. It was March of 1878, and she had traveled 3 weeks from Philadelphia to meet her aunt in Denver. But now, it appeared the final leg of her journey had just become impossibly complicated. "Stage ain't running no more today," the driver announced, yanking open the door with more force than necessary. "Company's pulling out. This here's the last run, and we're heading back east empty come morning." Florence gathered her skirts and stepped down onto the wooden platform, her traveling trunk landing with a heavy thud beside her. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the main street, and she found herself standing alone as the other passengers scattered to find alternative arrangements or lodging. Her reticule contained exactly $17.23, enough for perhaps 3 nights at a modest boarding house, but certainly not enough to hire a private wagon to Denver. "Miss, you cannot leave your belongings there." The station master, a portly man with sweat staining his collar, gestured impatiently at her trunk. "We're closing this depot within the hour. The stage company's declaring bankruptcy." "I understand, but I need passage to Denver. Surely there must be another coach, another company, something." Florence tried to keep the desperation from her voice, but she could hear it creeping in nonetheless. "Nothing regular. Might be a freight wagon heading that way in a week, maybe 2, could ask around." He was already turning away, dismissing her problem as readily as he would shoo a fly. Florence stood there as the reality of her situation settled over her like a heavy cloak. Behind her, the stage that had carried her across half the country was already being unhitched, the horses led away to the livery. 3 years ago, she had been a promising singer in Philadelphia, performing in respectable theaters to enthusiastic audiences. Then her voice had started failing, the high notes becoming unreliable, the power diminishing. Doctors had no explanation, no cure. She had watched her career crumble like dried leaves, watched the theater managers stop returning her letters, watched her savings dwindle until her aunt's invitation to come west had seemed like a lifeline. Now that lifeline had frayed to a single thread. "You look like you could use some help." The voice came from behind her, low and steady. Florence turned to find a man standing a respectful distance away, his hat in his hands. He was tall, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of creek water, watching her with genuine concern rather than the predatory interest she had learned to recognize in her theater days. His clothes were working clothes, dusty from travel, and his dark hair needed cutting. "The stage company folded," she said, stating the obvious because she did not know what else to say. "I heard. Name's Kade Gallagher. I run a ranch about 6 miles north of here, came into town for supplies." He glanced at her trunk, then back at her face. "You were heading to Denver?" "Yes." "My aunt is expecting me. I have no way to contact her, no way to get there, and apparently no way to stay here for long." The words tumbled out before she could stop them, exhaustion overwhelming her usual reserve. Kade was quiet for a moment, considering. "I might have a solution, though you will not like it much. My sister lives in Denver, married to a banker there. I am heading up that way week after next to visit her, bringing some horses I sold to a buyer near there. You could stay at my ranch until then. My housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, keeps everything proper and respectable. Then you could travel with me to Denver, and I would see you safely to your aunt." Florence studied his face, looking for any hint of deception or ulterior motive. She had become adept at reading men during her years in the theater, where performers learned quickly to distinguish between genuine kindness and dangerous manipulation. What she saw in Kade Gallagher's expression was simple honesty and perhaps a touch of loneliness that matched her own. "Why would you help a complete stranger?" she asked. "Because someone helped my sister once when she needed it, and because leaving you stranded here would not sit right with me." He shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable with the attention. "But I understand if you would rather make other arrangements. No offense taken." The sun was sinking lower, painting the Colorado sky in shades of orange and pink. Behind her, the station master was locking the depot doors. Florence thought about her dwindling funds, about sleeping in a boarding house filled with strangers, about trying to find safe passage through unfamiliar territory. Then she looked again at Kade Gallagher, at the calluses on his hands that spoke of honest work, at the straightforward way he met her eyes. "I accept your offer, Mr. Gallagher, and I am grateful for it." Something shifted in his expression, a warmth that had not been there before. "Just Kade is fine. Let me get my wagon loaded and we will head out before dark. Mrs. Chen will have supper ready, and she always cooks enough to feed half the territory." He hefted her trunk as though it weighed nothing and carried it to a sturdy wagon hitched nearby. Florence followed, her practical boots clicking against the wooden planks. She had left Philadelphia in her finest traveling dress, a deep blue wool with black trim that had seemed appropriate for the journey. Now it was covered in dust from 3 weeks of travel, and she felt as worn as the fabric. The ride to Kade's ranch took them along a well-maintained road that wound through rolling grassland. The mountains rose in the distance, still capped with snow despite the approaching spring. Florence sat on the wagon seat beside him, acutely aware of how close they were in the confined space, how the wagon's movements occasionally caused their shoulders to brush. He pointed out landmarks as they traveled, his voice carrying easily over the sound of the horses' hooves. "That creek there runs year-round, fed by snowmelt. The ranch sits just beyond that rise. My father started it in 1859, back when this was all much wilder. He passed 5 years ago, left it to me and my sister. Catherine took her share in cash when she married and moved to Denver. I kept the land." "Do you ranch cattle?" Florence asked, grateful for the distraction from her own troubled thoughts. "Cattle and horses both. The horses are what I love, though, breeding them, training them. There is something about earning a horse's trust, teaching it to respond to the lightest touch. Takes patience and time, but it is worth it." His face animated as he spoke, his hands light on the reins. They crested the rise, and Florence saw the ranch spread out before them. The main house was larger than she had expected, built from sturdy timber with a wide porch wrapping around the front. Several outbuildings dotted the property, including a substantial barn and a bunkhouse. Horses grazed in a fenced pasture, their coats gleaming in the fading light. It was beautiful in its simplicity, a place carved out of the wilderness through hard work and determination. A woman emerged from the house as they approached, wiping her hands on her apron. She was perhaps 50 years old, her black hair streaked with silver and pulled back in a neat bun. Her face showed both Chinese and European heritage, and her dark eyes assessed Florence with sharp intelligence. "You brought home a stray, Kade." The woman's voice held a hint of amusement rather than censure. "Mrs. Chen, this is Miss Florence Thatcher. The stage company folded, left her stranded. She will be staying with us until I make my trip to Denver, then I will see her safely to her aunt." Kade jumped down from the wagon and came around to help Florence descend. His hands were gentle but firm as he lifted her down, and he released her the moment her feet touched the ground. Mrs. Chen's expression softened immediately. "Poor thing. You look exhausted, child." Come inside. I will show you to a room and get some food in you. Kade, bring her trunk up to the blue room. The interior of the house surprised Florence again. It was clean and well-maintained, with comfortable furniture and curtains at the windows. Mrs. Chen led her upstairs to a bedroom that was simple but welcoming, with a brass bed covered in a wedding ring quilt and a washstand in the corner. A window looked out over the pasture where the horses grazed. The water in the pitcher is fresh. Supper will be ready in half an hour. Do not worry about dressing fancy, we keep things simple here. Mrs. Chen paused at the door. Kade is a good man, Miss Thatcher. He would cut off his own arm before causing harm to someone under his protection. You are safe here. Left alone, Florence sank onto the edge of the bed and allowed herself a moment to simply breathe. The room smelled of lavender and clean linen, a stark contrast to the dust and sweat of travel. She could hear Kade moving around downstairs, the murmur of his voice as he spoke with Mrs. Chen. 3 weeks ago, she had been in Philadelphia, packing up her small apartment and trying not to think about the career she was leaving behind. Now she was in Colorado, in a stranger's home, dependent on his charity for her immediate future. She washed her face and hands in the basin, changed into a simpler dress of gray cotton, and brushed the dust from her hair. When she looked in the small mirror above the washstand, she barely recognized herself. The face looking back was thinner than she remembered, with shadows under the eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights and too much worry. But there was something else there too, something that might have been the first stirring of hope. Downstairs, the dining room table was set for 3. Kade had cleaned up as well, his hair still damp from washing. He stood when Florence entered, pulling out a chair for her with the same easy courtesy he had shown since their meeting. Mrs. Chen brought out platters of food, fried chicken and potatoes and fresh bread with butter, and Florence realized she was ravenously hungry. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Kade spoke. So you were heading to Denver to meet your aunt. What brings you west from Philadelphia? If you do not mind my asking. Florence set down her fork, considering how much to share. I was a singer, performed in theaters. My voice started failing about a year ago. No one could tell me why or how to fix it. When the engagements stopped coming, I realized I needed to make a change. My aunt offered me a place with her, suggested I might find work as a governess or music teacher. You sang professionally. Kade leaned forward slightly, interested. That must have been something special. It was while it lasted. I loved it, the feeling of standing on stage, making people feel something through song. When it ended, it felt like losing a part of myself. She had not meant to be so honest, but something about the warm room and Kade's attentive silence loosened her tongue. Mrs. Chen made a sympathetic sound. Losing what you love is like a small death. But sometimes what seems like an ending is really a beginning in disguise. They talked through the meal, the conversation flowing easily. Kade told stories about the ranch, about difficult horses he had trained, and the satisfaction of watching them thrive. Mrs. Chen shared tales of her own journey west, how she had come from California 20 years earlier and found work with Kade's father. Florence found herself laughing at their anecdotes, the tension of the day slowly unwinding from her shoulders. After supper, Kade excused himself to check on the horses one final time before bed. Florence helped Mrs. Chen clear the dishes, despite the housekeeper's protests. He is not married. Florence asked, trying to sound casual as she dried a plate. Mrs. Chen gave her a knowing look. No, he was engaged once, about 4 years ago. Girl from town, pretty thing but spoiled. She decided ranch life was too hard, too isolated. Broke it off 2 weeks before the wedding and married a store clerk instead. Kade took it hard, threw himself into the work. He has not looked at another woman since, least not seriously. Florence absorbed this information, understanding dawning. That loneliness she had sensed in him was not just her imagination. He seems like a good man, the best I have known. He deserves someone who sees that, who appreciates what he has built here. Mrs. Chen handed her another plate to dry, someone who would not run at the first sign of difficulty. The next morning, Florence woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the sound of horses whinnying in the pasture. She dressed quickly and went downstairs to find Mrs. Chen already busy in the kitchen, the smell of coffee and bacon filling the air. Kade is out in the training corral. He starts early when he is working with a new horse. You can take him some coffee if you like. Mrs. Chen handed her a tin cup, wrapped in a cloth to protect her hands from the heat. Florence found him in the circular corral behind the barn, working with a young bay mare. He held a long lead rope, moving in a careful pattern that kept the horse trotting in circles around him. His movements were fluid and confident, and the horse responded to the smallest shift in his posture or the lightest pull on the rope. Florence leaned against the fence, watching in fascination. When he finally noticed her, Kade smiled and led the mare over to the fence. "Morning, you sleep well, better than I have in weeks. Mrs. Chen thought you might want coffee." She held out the cup and their fingers brushed as he took it. She is a wonder, that woman. Keeps this place running as much as I do. He took a long drink, then gestured to the mare. "This is Starlight. She is 2 years old, still learning what it means to work with people. She was running wild until last month when we brought her in. She is beautiful." Florence reached out cautiously, and the mare stretched her neck to sniff her hand. The horse's breath was warm against her palm. "She is smart, too. That is what makes the difference. You can train a dull horse to do its job, but a smart one will partner with you, think with you. Starlight here, she is going to be something special." The pride in his voice was evident. They stood there for a moment, both watching the horse, before Kade spoke again. "Would you like to learn to ride? We have a couple of weeks before we head to Denver. Might be a useful skill to have out here." Florence had never been on a horse in her life. In Philadelphia, she had relied on streetcars and her own 2 feet to get around. But something about the way Kade offered, the casual assumption that she was capable of learning, made her want to try. "I would like that," she said. Over the following days, Florence found herself settling into the rhythm of ranch life. Kade proved to be a patient teacher, starting her on a gentle mare named Daisy, who seemed to understand that her rider was a complete novice. He taught her how to approach a horse, how to bridle and saddle it, how to sit properly and use her legs to communicate direction. Florence discovered muscles she had not known she possessed, along with a growing confidence in her own abilities. In the afternoons, she helped Mrs. Chen with household tasks, learning to cook simple meals and mend work clothes. The housekeeper shared stories of her life, of coming to America as a young woman and building a place for herself in this rough territory. Florence found comfort in the older woman's pragmatic wisdom and gentle humor. The evenings were her favorite time. After supper, she and Kade would sit on the porch, watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold. They talked about everything and nothing, their conversations ranging from philosophy to practical matters to shared memories of childhood. Florence learned that Kade loved poetry, that he had taught himself to read beyond the basic primers by borrowing books from a traveling preacher. Kade learned that Florence had grown up in a boarding house, that her mother had died when she was young and her father had disappeared into a bottle of whiskey and never emerged. One evening, about a week into her stay, Kade asked the question she had been dreading. "Would you sing something for me? I know you said your voice has been troubling you, but I would love to hear you even just once." Florence felt her throat tighten with the familiar anxiety. I do not know if I can. What if it fails again? Then it fails, and we will still be sitting here on this porch, and I will still think you are remarkable. His voice was gentle but firm. You cannot let fear of failure stop you from trying, Florence. That is not living, that is just surviving. She took a deep breath, then another. The evening air was cool and sweet, carrying the scent of new grass and distant pine. She thought about the songs she used to perform, the arias and ballads that had filled theaters with sound. But those seemed wrong for this moment, too grand and formal. Instead, she chose a simple folk song her mother had sung to her as a child, a gentle melody about a bird learning to fly. The first notes came out uncertain, wavering. Florence almost stopped, the old fear rising up. But Kade's steady gaze encouraged her, and she pushed through. The second verse was stronger, her voice finding the melody more surely. By the final chorus, she was singing as she had not sung in months, the notes clear and true in the twilight air. When she finished, there was a long moment of silence. Then Kade spoke, his voice rough with emotion. That was beautiful, Florence. Whatever happened before, whatever took your voice away, it is not gone. It has just been waiting for you to feel safe enough to use it again. Florence felt tears on her cheeks and brushed them away quickly. I have been so afraid. Afraid that I had lost it forever, that I would never sing again. Fear is a liar. It tells us we are not strong enough, not good enough, that we should not even try, but you are stronger than you think. He reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm around hers. I have seen it this past week, the way you tackle new things without complaint, the way you keep going even when you are tired or uncertain. That takes real courage. They sat there hand in hand as the stars emerged overhead, neither of them speaking, neither of them needing to. Something had shifted between them, an understanding that went beyond words. Florence realized she had not thought about her lost career or her uncertain future in days. She had been too busy living in the present, learning new skills, discovering new parts of herself. The second week passed even more quickly than the first. Kade took Florence out riding beyond the ranch boundaries, showing her the wild beauty of the Colorado landscape. They rode up into the foothills, where aspens were just beginning to leaf out and wildflowers carpeted the meadows. He taught her to read the land, to spot the signs of deer and elk, to understand how water and weather shaped everything. One afternoon, they stopped beside a fast-flowing creek to rest the horses. Kade produced a packet of sandwiches that Mrs. Chen had packed, and they sat on a flat rock beside the water to eat. The sound of the creek was musical, tumbling over stones in an ever-changing pattern. I have been thinking, Kade said, not looking at her. After we get you to Denver to your aunt, what are your plans? Are you fixed on staying there? Florence had been thinking about the same question, had been avoiding examining it too closely because the answer frightened her. I suppose I will look for work as a governess or music teacher, as my aunt suggested. Build a new life there. And if you had another option, would you consider it? Now he did look at her, his creek water eyes serious and intent. Her heart began to beat faster. What kind of option? Kade set down his sandwich and turned to face her fully. I think you know I have developed feelings for you, Florence. These past 2 weeks, getting to know you, watching you adapt and grow, it has been like watching the sun come out after a long winter. I am not good with fancy words, and I do not have much to offer except hard work in this land. But if you would consider staying, building a life here with me, I would count myself the luckiest man in Colorado. Florence stared at him, her mind racing. She had felt the connection growing between them, had lain awake the past few nights acknowledging her own deepening feelings. But she had assumed it was impossible, that their lives were too different, that she was just a temporary guest who would soon move on. Now he was offering her something she had not dared to imagine. A home, a partner, a future that did not involve constantly looking backward at what she had lost. Kade, I barely know you. We have known each other only 2 weeks. People do not make decisions like this so quickly. Out here, they do. When you know something is right, when you feel it in your bones, waiting does not change anything. It just wastes time you could be spending together. He reached for her hand again. I am not asking you to decide right now. Come to Denver with me as we planned. Meet your aunt. See what that life would look like. Then, if you want, come back here. Give us a chance to see if this feeling between us is real and lasting. And if I come back, what then? Her voice was barely above a whisper. Then we court properly, with Mrs. Chen chaperoning and me calling on you like a gentleman. We take our time, get to know each other even better. And if, after all that, you still feel the way I think you do, the way I hope you do, then I would ask you to marry me and make this ranch your home. He said it simply, without artifice or embellishment, and that honesty made it all the more powerful. Florence looked at their joined hands, at the calluses on his fingers that spoke of hard work, at the gentleness with which he held her despite his strength. She thought about the past 2 weeks, about how she had felt more alive, more herself than she had in years. She thought about the songs she had started singing again in the evenings, her voice growing stronger with each performance. She thought about the way Kade looked at her, like she was something precious and rare. I will think about it, she said finally. That is all I can promise right now. That is all I am asking. He smiled, and it transformed his face, making him look younger and less careworn. Now finish your sandwich before the horses eat it. They rode back to the ranch in companionable silence, but everything felt different now. The air seemed brighter, the world more vivid. Florence caught herself imagining what it would be like to live here permanently, to wake up every morning to the sight of the mountains, to work beside Kade building something lasting and real. That evening, Mrs. Chen watched them with knowing eyes as they sat together after supper. When Kade went out to check the horses, the housekeeper pulled Florence aside. He asked you, did he not? I can see it written all over both your faces. Florence felt herself blushing. He said I should go to Denver first, meet my aunt, then decide if I want to come back. Smart man. Giving you a choice, not trying to trap you into anything. Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly. So what are you going to do? I honestly do not know. Part of me wants to say yes immediately, to stay here and never leave. But the other part is terrified. What if I am just running from my problems in Philadelphia? What if this is just a reaction to everything I lost? Mrs. Chen took Florence's hands in hers, her grip surprisingly strong. Listen to me, child. I have watched you these past 2 weeks. You are not running from anything. You are running toward something better, something real. And Kade, he is the best man I know. He will never raise a hand to you in anger, never belittle your dreams, never make you feel small. He will work himself to the bone to provide for you and any children you might have. That is worth more than all the fancy theaters in Philadelphia. But what about my singing? What if I lose my voice again out here? What if you do not? What if being here, being happy, being loved is exactly what you needed to heal? Mrs. Chen released her hands and stepped back. Fear is natural, Florence, but do not let it make your decisions for you. Go to Denver. Meet your aunt. Then ask yourself one simple question. Where do you want to build your life? With strangers in a city teaching other people's children? Or here, with a man who looks at you like you hung the moon? The next few days were a flurry of preparation for the trip to Denver. Kade had business to conduct in addition to delivering Florence to her aunt, horses to deliver to his buyer and supplies to purchase for the ranch. Mrs. Chen packed provisions for the journey, enough food to feed them for the 3-day trip, each way. The morning of their departure, Florence stood in the blue bedroom and looked around at the space that had become hers these past 2 weeks. She had been happy here, truly happy, in a way she had not been since before her voice started failing. The thought of leaving, even temporarily, caused an ache in her chest. Kade was waiting by the wagon, checking the harness one final time. He had hitched a team of 4 horses, strong animals capable of pulling the loaded wagon to Denver and back. Behind the wagon seat was space for Florence to sit more comfortably than she had on the ride from Loveland, with blankets and cushions that Mrs. Chen had arranged. "Ready?" Kade asked when he saw her approach. "As ready as I will ever be," Florence replied. Mrs. Chen hugged her tightly before she climbed up. "You come back to us, you hear? This house needs a mistress, and Kade needs someone to keep him from working himself into an early grave." The journey to Denver took them through changing landscape, from the rolling grasslands around Loveland up into the foothills, and then down toward the sprawling city. They traveled at a steady pace, stopping to rest the horses regularly and making camp the first 2 nights under the stars. Kade proved to be as competent at trail cooking as he was at everything else, preparing simple but satisfying meals over the campfire. On the second night, as they sat watching the flames dance, Florence found her courage. "Tell me about your engagement, Mrs. Chen mentioned it, and I would like to understand." Kade was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "Her name was Margaret. We grew up together, started courting when I was 21 and she was 19. She was pretty and lively, always laughing. I thought she was happy at the ranch, that she understood what kind of life it would be. Then, 2 weeks before the wedding, she told me she could not do it. Could not live so far from town, could not handle the isolation, could not bear the thought of spending her life doing ranch chores and raising children in the wilderness. She married Thomas Winters a month later. He owns the general store in Loveland, lives in a nice house right on Main Street." "That must have hurt terribly," Florence said softly. "It did. But looking back now, I am grateful it happened before the wedding rather than after. She would have been miserable, and I would have felt like I was trapping her in a life she did not want. Better to find out early that we wanted different things." He looked up from the fire, meeting Florence's eyes. "That is why I am not pushing you, why I want you to really think about what you are choosing. If you decide the ranch is not for you, if you want city life and theaters and all the things I cannot provide, I would rather know now. I could not bear to watch you slowly wither away, regretting your choice." Florence moved closer to him, drawn by the raw honesty in his voice. "I do not think you understand what you are offering me, Kade. In Philadelphia, I was completely alone. My father drank himself to death years ago. I have no siblings, no close friends. The theater people, they were colleagues, not family. My career was everything, and when it ended, I had nothing. Coming here, meeting you, it has given me something I never thought I would have, a place to belong. Is that enough, though, just belonging?" He reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch feather light. "I want you to be happy, Florence, truly happy. I think I could be. I think I am when I am with you." She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes. "I am still afraid of making the wrong choice, afraid of failing again, but I am starting to think that maybe Mrs. Chen was right. Maybe fear should not get to make my decisions." Kade pulled her closer, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. They sat like that, watching the fire burn down to embers, neither of them speaking but both understanding that something fundamental had been decided. Florence felt a peace settle over her that had nothing to do with certainty about the future and everything to do with trusting the present moment. They reached Denver on the afternoon of the 3rd day. The city sprawled before them, a mix of wooden buildings and newer brick structures, streets crowded with wagons and pedestrians. It was the largest place Florence had seen since leaving Philadelphia, and after the quiet of the ranch, the noise and bustle felt overwhelming. Kade navigated the busy streets with practiced ease, finally stopping in front of a neat house on a tree-lined residential street. "This is the address you gave me. Your aunt's place." Florence stared at the house, trying to imagine living there, building a life in this city. It looked pleasant enough, with lace curtains in the windows and a small garden in front. But it did not feel like home the way the ranch had started to feel like home. Before she could climb down, the front door opened and a woman emerged. She was perhaps 60 years old, with gray hair pulled back in a severe style and a pinched expression that suggested chronic disapproval. She looked Florence up and down with cold eyes. "Florence, is that you? You look dreadful. The journey must have been absolutely horrendous." The woman did not move to embrace her or show any sign of welcome beyond the bare words. "Hello, Aunt Beatrice. Yes, the journey was long, but I am well." Florence felt her heart sinking as she took in her aunt's demeanor. This was the woman who had invited her west, who was supposed to provide a new start. Beatrice's gaze shifted to Kade, her expression hardening further. "And who is this? I sent money for a stage ticket, not for you to hire private escorts." Kade's jaw tightened, but his voice remained polite. "Kade Gallagher, madam. The stage company folded before Miss Thatcher could complete her journey. I offered her respectable lodging at my ranch with my housekeeper as chaperone until I could bring her to Denver safely." "How irregular and highly inappropriate. People will talk, Florence. You have barely arrived and already you are creating scandal." Beatrice turned and walked back into the house, clearly expecting them to follow. Florence felt frozen, rooted to the wagon seat. This was worse than she had imagined. The invitation to come west had been cordial enough in letters, suggesting warmth and family connection. The reality was clearly very different. Kade reached over and took her hand. "You do not have to stay here," he said quietly. "Say the word, and we will turn this wagon around right now." I should at least give her a chance. Maybe she is just having a bad day. Maybe she is not usually like this. But even as she said the words, Florence doubted them. They unloaded her trunk and carried it into the house. The interior was as cold as Beatrice's greeting, filled with stiff furniture and heavy curtains that blocked most of the natural light. Every surface was cluttered with china figurines and antimacassars, giving the impression of a museum rather than a home. Beatrice showed Florence to a tiny room at the back of the house, barely large enough for a narrow bed and a small wardrobe. "You will stay here. I expect you to help with housework in exchange for your room and board while you look for employment. I have arranged an interview for you tomorrow with the family of a banker. They need a governess for their 3 daughters. Thank you, Aunt Beatrice. I appreciate your help." Florence tried to inject warmth into her voice, but it came out flat. "Yes, well, family obligation and all that. Your mother was my sister, though she made poor choices that led to hardship. I trust you will not follow her path." Beatrice sniffed and left the room, closing the door firmly behind her. Florence sank onto the bed, fighting back tears. Kade had stayed downstairs, giving her privacy with her aunt, but now she wished desperately that he had come up with her. She had never felt more alone. A soft knock on the door made her look up. Kade stood in the doorway, his expression troubled. "Your aunt invited me to stay for supper. I think she wants to interrogate me about the past 2 weeks. Are you all right?" "No, but I will be." Florence stood and straightened her dress, trying to compose herself. "Let us get through this meal and then you can go to your sister's house. I am sure you are eager to see her." Supper was an ordeal. Beatrice peppered Kade with invasive questions about the ranch, about his family background, about the propriety of Florence's stay. Through it all, Kade remained unfailingly polite, answering honestly but without elaboration. Florence picked at her food, her appetite gone. When the meal finally ended, Kade stood to leave. "I will be staying with my sister for the next few days while I conduct my business. If you need anything, Florence, anything at all, send word to Kade Gallagher Morris. She lives on Grant Street. Her husband is Benjamin Morris." "That will not be necessary," Beatrice interjected. "Florence will be perfectly fine here with me. There is no need for further contact." Florence walked Kade to the door, away from her aunt's watchful eyes. "Thank you for everything, for bringing me here safely, for being so patient with her." "I do not like leaving you here." His voice was low, urgent. "She treats you like a burden, not family." "I will manage. I have dealt with worse, and I need to at least try to make this work, to give it a fair chance." Florence tried to sound confident, but she could hear the doubt in her own voice. Kade hesitated, then pulled a piece of paper from his pocket and pressed it into her hand. "Catherine's address. Promise me you will use it if you need help. Promise me, Florence." "I promise." He looked like he wanted to say more, wanted to do more, but Beatrice was hovering in the hallway. He settled for taking Florence's hand and squeezing it gently. "I will come by in a few days before I head back to the ranch to see how you are settling in." After he left, the house felt even colder and more oppressive. Beatrice immediately launched into a lecture about propriety and reputation, about how Florence must be above reproach if she was to find respectable employment. Florence endured it silently, then retreated to her tiny room as soon as she could. She lay on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, and tried to imagine spending months or years in this house. Tried to imagine working as a governess, teaching other people's children while living in their homes or in cramped quarters like these. Tried to imagine building a life in Denver without Kade, without the wide open spaces of the ranch, without the sense of possibility that had been growing in her heart. The next morning, Beatrice dragged Florence to the interview with the banker's family. The banker, Mr. Howard, was a pompous man who clearly believed he was doing Florence an immense favor by considering her for employment. His wife was a faded woman who looked perpetually exhausted, and their 3 daughters were spoiled and undisciplined, shrieking and running through the house while their mother wrung her hands helplessly. You would be responsible for their education, of course. Reading, writing, arithmetic, basic French. Also their deportment and manners, which, as you can see, need considerable work. Mr. Howard spoke over the noise of his daughters arguing loudly in the next room. You would live here, sharing a room with the girls. Meals provided, of course, and $20 per month in wages. Florence looked at the chaos, at the spoiled children who would resist any attempt at education, at the parents who clearly had no interest in actually raising their offspring. She thought about what her life would be like here, serving at the whim of this family, never having privacy or peace, earning barely enough to save anything for her future. "I appreciate the opportunity, Mr. Howard, but I do not believe this position is right for me." The words came out before she had fully decided to say them, but as soon as they were spoken, Florence felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Mr. Howard looked affronted. "Not right for you. Young woman, you should be grateful for such an opportunity. Your aunt assured me you were desperate for employment." "I am looking for employment, but I believe we would not suit each other. I wish you luck in finding a governess who is a better match for your family's needs." Florence stood and walked out, leaving Mr. Howard sputtering and Beatrice pale with fury. On the street, her aunt grabbed her arm hard enough to bruise. "How dare you embarrass me like that? Do you have any idea how difficult it was to arrange that interview? You will go back in there right now and apologize, accept the position gracefully." "No, Florence pulled her arm free. "I will not spend my life being treated like a servant by people who have no respect for me or my work. There must be other options." "Other options? You think you can be choosy? You have no money, no prospects, nothing but what I am willing to provide out of the goodness of my heart. You will take what is offered and be grateful." Beatrice's face was red with anger. Florence felt something inside her break free, a chain she had not fully realized she was wearing. "I do have other options, Aunt Beatrice. I have a place where I am welcomed and valued, where people treat me with kindness rather than contempt. I thought I should give this a chance, should try to make it work out of family obligation. But I see now that you do not want me here. You want a servant you can control, someone to order around and criticize. That is not family, and I will not accept it." She turned and walked away, her heart pounding but her steps steady. Behind her, Beatrice called out threats and recriminations, but Florence did not look back. She had the address Kade had given her tucked in her pocket, and she pulled it out now, checking the street signs to orient herself. Catherine Morris's house was in a nicer part of town, a substantial brick home with well-maintained gardens. Florence stood at the gate for a moment, gathering her courage, then walked up the path and knocked on the door. A maid answered and looked at her questioningly. "I am looking for Mrs. Catherine Morris. I am Florence Thatcher. Her brother Kade brought me to Denver. He said I could contact her if I needed assistance." The maid's expression warmed immediately. "Oh, Miss Thatcher, Mrs. Morris has been hoping you would call. Please come in. She is in the parlor." Catherine Morris was a younger, feminine version of Kade, with the same creek water eyes and genuine warmth. She stood as Florence entered, coming forward with her hands outstretched. "Miss Thatcher, how wonderful to meet you. Kade has been here twice already, full of stories about you. Please sit down. You look distressed. What has happened?" The kindness in her voice was Florence's undoing. The whole story poured out: the disaster with her aunt, the terrible job interview, the realization that she could not build a life in Denver under those circumstances. Catherine listened without interruption, her expression growing more sympathetic as the tale progressed. "Well," Catherine said when Florence finally fell silent, "it seems to me you have a decision to make. You can stay in Denver, find other lodging and other employment opportunities, build an independent life here. Or you can return to Loveland with Kade, see where that path leads." She leaned forward, her gaze intent. "But before you decide, I need to tell you something about my brother. He is the most loyal, hard-working, decent man I have ever known. He loved our parents fiercely, and when our father died, he took on the ranch like it was his sacred duty. He works from before dawn until after dark most days. He rarely comes to town, rarely socializes, rarely does anything that does not involve the ranch or the horses. In 4 years since his engagement ended, I have not seen him show interest in any woman. Until now. He told you about me." Florence felt her cheeks warming. "He has talked about nothing else. The way you adapted to ranch life, the way you learned to ride, your singing, your courage. Miss Thatcher, my brother is not a man who opens his heart easily. If he has offered you a place in his life, you can trust that the offer is sincere and lasting. But you need to be equally sure of what you want. The ranch is isolated, the work is hard, and there are days when you will wonder if you made the right choice. You need to be certain." Florence thought about the past 2 weeks at the ranch, about the mornings waking to birdsong and mountain air, about the evenings on the porch with Kade's steady presence beside her. She thought about the way her voice had returned, clear and strong, when she felt safe enough to use it. She thought about Mrs. Chen's wisdom and the satisfaction of learning new skills. She thought about how alive she had felt, how present in each moment. "I am certain," she said. I was certain before I ever came to Denver, but I needed to see the alternative to be sure. This is not where I belong. The ranch, Kade, that is home. I just hope it is not too late, that I have not ruined everything by waiting." Catherine smiled, a broad, delighted smile that transformed her face. "It is definitely not too late. In fact, I believe Kade is coming here for supper this evening. Why do not you stay, and we can tell him together?" The hours until evening passed in a pleasant blur. Catherine proved to be excellent company, showing Florence around her home and sharing stories of growing up at the ranch. Her husband Benjamin came home for lunch and proved to be a jovial man who clearly adored his wife. They had 2 children, a boy of 3 and a girl barely a year old, and Catherine glowed when she spoke about them. "I love Denver, love the life we have built here," Catherine confided as they sat in the garden watching the children play. "But I will always miss the ranch a little. The space, the quiet, the way you can see forever on a clear day. Kade chose the right path staying there. It is where he belongs. And if you choose it too, I think you will understand what I mean. There is something about that land that gets into your soul." When Kade arrived that evening, he looked tired and worried. Catherine greeted him at the door, then gestured toward the parlor where Florence waited. He froze when he saw her, his expression cycling through surprise, hope, and fear in rapid succession. "Florence, what are you doing here? Did something happen with your aunt?" He crossed the room quickly, his eyes scanning her as if checking for injuries. "Everything happened with my aunt. She is dreadful, cold, and critical and demanding. The job she arranged was even worse. I walked away from both of them this morning." Florence stood to face him, her heart racing. "I came here because I needed to tell you something, and I could not wait. I choose the ranch, Kade. I choose you. If the offer is still open, if you still want me, I want to go home. To our home." For a moment, Kade just stared at her. Then he crossed the remaining distance between them and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "Are you absolutely sure? You are not just running from a bad situation. I am running toward a good one. Toward you, toward the life we could build together." Florence pulled back enough to look up at him. "I have never been more certain of anything." Kade's kiss was gentle but thorough, full of promise and relief and joy. When they finally broke apart, Catherine was standing in the doorway with Benjamin, both of them grinning widely. "So I take it you are not staying for supper," Catherine teased. "Actually, I think we should. I want to spend time with you and your family, for Florence to get to know you properly. Then tomorrow, we head home. Together." Kade kept his arm around Florence's waist, as if afraid she might disappear if he let go. They stayed 3 more days in Denver, long enough for Kade to complete his business and for Florence to retrieve her trunk from her aunt's house. The confrontation with Beatrice was brief and unpleasant, with her aunt making clear that Florence should expect no further help or contact from the family. Florence found she did not care. She had found her real family, the people who valued her for who she was rather than what she could provide. The journey back to Loveland felt like the opposite of the journey away. Where before Florence had been tense with uncertainty, now she was relaxed and happy. They talked about the future, making plans for how their courtship would proceed, discussing what changes Florence might want to make to the house when it became hers. "I want to do this properly," Kade insisted as they made camp the second night. "Court you the right way, give you time to be absolutely certain. Mrs. Chen can chaperone, and I will not rush you into anything." Florence smiled at his earnestness. "I appreciate that, but I should tell you, I am already certain. However long you need to be comfortable with our decision, I will wait, but my heart is already made up." They arrived back at the ranch on a beautiful spring afternoon, the mountains clear and sharp against the blue sky. Mrs. Chen rushed out to meet them, her face splitting into a wide smile when she saw Florence in the wagon. "You came back. I told Kade you would, but he was worried." She pulled Florence into a fierce hug as soon as she climbed down. "Welcome home, child." "It is good to be home," Florence replied, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The courtship that followed was unlike anything Florence had experienced in her theater days, when men had sent flowers and written overblown poetry in attempts to win her favor. Kade's courtship was quieter but deeper, built on shared work and honest conversation. They rode together in the mornings, worked side by side on ranch tasks in the afternoons, and spent evenings on the porch talking about their dreams and fears and hopes. He took her into town to meet people, introducing her to the shopkeepers and ranchers who formed the community around Loveland. Some of them looked at her with curiosity, wondering about the Philadelphia singer who had come west and stayed. But most welcomed her warmly, recognizing that she was genuine in her desire to make a life there. Florence started singing again, not in theaters but in the small church in town and at gatherings in people's homes. Her voice had fully returned, stronger and more confident than before. She realized that Mrs. Chen had been right. The problem had never been physical but emotional. She had been so consumed by fear and grief over her lost career that her body had responded by shutting down. Now, surrounded by love and acceptance, her voice had healed. 3 months after her return, on a perfect June evening with the last light painting the mountains gold, Kade took Florence out to their favorite spot by the creek. He had packed a picnic, and they sat on their usual rock, watching the water flow past. "Florence, I know we said we would take our time, but I have to ask. I cannot wait any longer." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "This was my grandmother's ring. My father gave it to my mother when they married, and she left it to me when she died. I would be honored if you would wear it, if you would agree to be my wife." The ring was simple but beautiful, a gold band with a small sapphire that caught the light like the creek water. Florence felt tears streaming down her face as she nodded. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Kade slipped the ring onto her finger, then kissed her with a passion that had been building over months of patient courtship. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Florence Thatcher. I think I started loving you that first day in Loveland, when you stepped off that stage and it left you behind. I told myself then that the stage left you with me, and I would do everything in my power to make you happy you stayed." Florence laughed through her tears. "You actually said that?" "That day, not out loud, but I thought it. I saw you standing there, lost and afraid but trying so hard to be brave, and something in my heart just knew." He kissed her again, softer this time. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me." They were married in August, in the small church in Loveland with half the town in attendance. Catherine and Benjamin came from Denver with their children. Mrs. Chen stood up with Florence since she had no family of her own to attend. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, with Florence singing a hymn that left not a dry eye in the church. The ranch became fully theirs, and Florence threw herself into making it a true home. She planted gardens, filling the space around the house with flowers and vegetables. She learned to cook the foods Kade loved, to mend the endless wear and tear on work clothes, to manage the household accounts. But she also kept singing, performing whenever there was a gathering and teaching music to children in town who wanted to learn. Their first year of marriage was everything Florence had hoped for and more. They worked together building the ranch, adding new horses to the breeding program and expanding their cattle herd. Kade taught Florence everything he knew about ranching, and she proved to be an apt student with good instincts for the work. They made decisions together, partners in every sense of the word. In the evenings, they would sit on their porch and watch the sunset, just as they had during those early days of courtship. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they sat in comfortable silence, sometimes Florence sang while Kade listened with his eyes closed and a smile on his face. Those were the moments she treasured most, the quiet intimacy of two people who had chosen each other and never regretted that choice. Mrs. Chen continued as their housekeeper, but she became more like family than an employee. She was the first to notice when Florence started feeling unwell in the mornings, the first to suspect the reason why. "You are pregnant," Mrs. Chen announced one morning when Florence emerged from the bedroom looking pale. "I would bet my life on it." Florence had suspected the same thing but had been afraid to say it out loud, afraid to hope. "I think you are right. I need to tell Kade." She found him in the barn, working with Starlight, who was now fully trained and had become one of the ranch's prize breeding mares. He looked up when Florence entered, his face breaking into the smile he reserved just for her. "I have news," she said, unable to contain her own smile. "We are going to have a baby." Kade dropped the brush he was holding and crossed to her in 3 long strides, sweeping her up in his arms. "Are you certain? Are you well?" "When?" "I am certain I am well, and I think sometime in late winter or early spring." Florence wrapped her arms around his neck, reveling in his joy. "We are going to be parents, Kade." He set her down gently, his hand going immediately to her still flat stomach. "A baby, our baby." His voice was full of wonder. "I am going to be a father." Their son was born on a snowy March morning in 1879, arriving just after dawn with a lusty cry that announced his presence to the world. Kade held him with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face as he looked at the tiny red face and perfect miniature fingers. "He is beautiful, Florence. He is absolutely perfect." Kade bent to kiss her forehead, then the baby's. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names for months, unable to agree on anything. But now, looking at her husband holding their son, Florence knew exactly what felt right. "Thomas, after your father, so part of him lives on in this new generation." "Thomas," Kade repeated, testing it out. "Thomas Gallagher." "Yes. That is exactly right." Thomas was a happy baby who grew into a curious toddler, trailing after his father around the ranch and trying to mimic everything Kade did. Florence divided her time between caring for him and continuing her work with the ranch and her music. It was exhausting but fulfilling in ways she had never imagined. When Thomas was 2, Florence discovered she was pregnant again. Their daughter Elizabeth arrived in the fall of 1881, a quiet baby with Kade's eyes and Florence's dark hair. Having 2 children made life even more chaotic, but Florence loved every minute of it. She would watch Kade with their children, seeing his patience and gentleness, and fall in love with him all over again. The ranch prospered under their joint management. Kade's horse breeding program became known throughout the territory, with buyers coming from as far as Wyoming and New Mexico to purchase his animals. Florence started a small music school, teaching children from town and the surrounding ranches. The money was not much, but it gave her an outlet for her artistic side and helped families who could not afford formal music education. Years passed in a blur of seasons and milestones. Thomas learned to ride almost before he could walk, proving to have his father's gift with horses. Elizabeth showed her mother's musical talent, singing before she could properly talk. They added a 3rd child, a daughter named Margaret, and then a 4th, a son named William. The house that had once seemed spacious now felt full to bursting with the noise and chaos of family life. Through it all, Florence and Kade remained the steady center, their love deepening with each passing year. They had their disagreements, of course, the normal friction of 2 strong-willed people building a life together. But they had learned early on to talk through problems rather than letting them fester, to approach challenges as partners rather than adversaries. On their 10th anniversary, Kade took Florence back to the spot by the creek where he had proposed. The children were with Mrs. Chen for the night, giving them rare time alone. They sat on their rock and watched the water flow past, just as they had done so many times before. "You ever regret it?" Kade asked quietly. "Giving up the stage, your career in Philadelphia, all of that for this life?" Florence looked at him in genuine surprise. "Not for a single moment. That life was never really mine, Kade. I was playing a role, being what other people wanted me to be. This life, our life, this is real. These past 10 years have been the happiest of my life. Even the hard parts. The isolation, the winters when we are snowed in for weeks, the endless work, especially the hard parts, because we face them together. Because I know that no matter what happens, you will be beside me." She took his hand, threading her fingers through his. "The stage left me behind that day in Loveland, and I will be forever grateful that it did, because it left me with you." Kade pulled her close, and they sat together as the sun set and the stars emerged overhead. Florence thought about that frightened woman who had stepped off the stagecoach 10 years ago, uncertain of her future and grieving her past. She was grateful to that woman for being brave enough to accept help from a kind stranger, for being willing to take a chance on an uncertain future. The ranch continued to thrive as their children grew. Thomas proved to have his father's skill with horses, often working alongside Kade in the training corrals. Elizabeth's voice developed into something remarkable, clear and pure, and Florence taught her everything she knew about singing. Margaret showed an aptitude for business, helping Florence manage the household accounts and the music school. William was still young but showed signs of being the adventurer of the family, always climbing trees and exploring the furthest reaches of the ranch. When Thomas turned 18, he told his parents he wanted to start his own horse breeding program, specializing in working horses for ranchers rather than the pleasure horses Kade had focused on. Kade helped him purchase land adjoining the ranch and set him up with his first breeding stock. Watching his son succeed filled Kade with a pride that was almost overwhelming. Elizabeth, at 16, was starting to perform in larger venues, traveling occasionally to Denver with Florence to sing in churches and concert halls. She had inherited not just her mother's voice, but her mother's joy in performance. Florence would watch her daughter on stage and remember her own theater days without regret, happy that Elizabeth could pursue the dream in a healthier, more sustainable way. One evening, when Elizabeth returned from a particularly successful performance in Denver, she found her parents on their usual spot on the porch. She sat down on the steps and looked up at them, her face serious. "Did you ever wish you could have kept singing professionally, Mother?" "Do you ever resent having to give it up?" Florence considered the question carefully. "I used to think that singing on stage was the most important thing in the world, the only thing that mattered. When I lost it, I thought I had lost everything. But what I learned, what your father taught me, is that singing was never really about the stage or the applause. It was about connecting with people, about making them feel something. I do that now when I teach, when I sing in church, when I sing to you children. The venue does not matter. The connection is what counts. So you do not miss it at all," Elizabeth pressed. "I miss certain aspects of it. The excitement, the challenge of a difficult piece, the satisfaction of a performance well done. But I do not miss the insecurity, the constant competition, the feeling that I was only as good as my last show. This life, the one I built with your father, it has given me something much more valuable, belonging. I would not trade that for all the stages in the world." Kade reached over and took Florence's hand, squeezing gently. Even after almost 20 years of marriage, his touch still made her heart skip a beat. Elizabeth smiled, seeming satisfied with the answer, and went inside to help Mrs. Chen with supper preparations. "You really do not have regrets?" Kade asked when they were alone again. "Not a single one. You? Only that I did not meet you sooner. Think of all the years we could have had together." He pulled her closer, and she rested her head on his shoulder. They sat there as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, watching the mountains turn dark against the fading light. The sounds of their family drifted out from the house, Margaret practicing piano under Mrs. Chen's supervision, William arguing with Thomas about something, Elizabeth's laugh ringing out clear and bright. Florence thought about the journey that had brought her here, about the stagecoach that had left her stranded in a small Colorado town, about the cowboy who had offered her help without expectation of anything in return. She thought about the choices she had made, the fear she had pushed through, the love she had allowed herself to embrace. Every step of the path had led her exactly where she was meant to be. "The stage left me with you," she whispered, echoing Kade's words from so many years ago. "And you gave me everything I never knew I needed." Kade kissed the top of her head, his arm tightening around her. "We gave it to each other." As full dark descended and the first stars appeared, they rose and went inside to join their family for supper. The house was warm and full of life, exactly as Florence had always dreamed a home should be. She looked around the table at her children, at Mrs. Chen, who had become a beloved grandmother figure, at Kade at the head of the table with his creek water eyes full of love when he looked at her. This was her stage now, this life they had built together, and she would not trade it for anything. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. Margaret, always the practical one, married a young lawyer from Denver and moved to the city, though she visited frequently. William, true to his adventurous nature, spent several years exploring the Western Territories before finally settling down on a small ranch in Montana. Thomas expanded his horse breeding operation until it rivaled his father's in scope and success. Elizabeth continued to sing, eventually marrying a music professor and splitting her time between performing and teaching. Kade and Florence became grandparents, delighting in the arrival of each new baby. They loved having grandchildren visit the ranch, teaching them to ride and sharing stories of the old days. Mrs. Chen, now well into her 70s but still sharp as a tack, ruled the kitchen with gentle authority and spoiled the grandchildren outrageously. On a summer evening in 1898, Florence and Kade celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary. Their children had organized a party, filling the ranch with friends and family from across the territory. There was music and dancing, food and laughter, stories shared and memories made. As the party wound down and guests began to depart, Florence and Kade slipped away to their spot by the creek. The water flowed past as it always had, constant and unchanging even as everything around it changed. 20 years, Kade marveled. It feels like both forever and no time at all. I know what you mean. Sometimes I can barely remember my life before you before this. It is like everything before was just preparation for finding you. Florence leaned against him, comfortable and content. I think about that day in Loveland sometimes. What if you had found another way to Denver? What if I had not been in town that particular afternoon? Would we have ever met? Kade's voice was thoughtful. I believe we would have found each other somehow. Some things are meant to be. Florence tilted her head up to look at him. But I am grateful it happened the way it did, that the stage left me stranded, that you were there to help, that I was brave enough to accept. Every moment led us here. They returned to the house to find their children had cleaned up and were sitting on the porch, talking and laughing together. Florence felt her heart swell with gratitude for this family they had created, these people who loved each other fiercely and showed up for each other always. The next few years brought changes. Mrs. Chen passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 78, leaving a hole in their lives that could never be filled. Florence and Kade mourned her deeply, recognizing that she had been instrumental in bringing them together and supporting their family all these years. They buried her in the small cemetery outside Loveland, with half the town in attendance to pay respects to a woman who had touched so many lives with her quiet wisdom and generosity. Kade started slowing down as he entered his 50s, no longer able to work from dawn to dusk the way he had in his younger years. Thomas gradually took over more of the ranch operations, running both properties with the same dedication his father had always shown. Florence continued teaching music, though she limited her students to just a few each season. She still sang, but now it was mostly for her own pleasure and for family gatherings. One fall evening, as they sat on the porch watching the leaves change color, Kade turned to Florence with a serious expression. "I have been thinking about something, about how lucky we have been, how blessed this life has been, and I want to do something to help others have similar chances." "What are you thinking?" Florence asked, intrigued. "I want to set up a fund through the church in town to help young people who get stranded or find themselves in difficult circumstances, like you were that day the stage company folded. Give them a safe place to stay, help them find their footing, maybe even give them a chance to learn a trade or skill. Nothing big, just enough to make a difference when someone needs it most." Florence felt tears prick her eyes. This was exactly the kind of thing Kade would think of, always looking for ways to help others. "I think that is a wonderful idea. Let's do it together, make it a project we can work on." They established the fund the following spring, contributing money from their savings and organizing fundraising events. Florence gave concerts with Elizabeth to raise money. Thomas donated foals to be auctioned off. Even Margaret convinced her lawyer husband to provide free legal services to people helped by the fund. The community embraced the project, contributing generously and volunteering their time. Over the following years, the fund helped dozens of people. A widow left destitute when her husband died, a young man trying to escape an abusive situation, a family whose farm had failed and needed a fresh start. Each person helped received not just financial assistance, but connection to the community, opportunities to learn skills, and the kind of support that could transform a life. Florence and Kade took particular interest in each case, often meeting with the people personally and following their progress over time. It gave them tremendous satisfaction to see lives changed, to know they were making a real difference. It also reminded them both of that crucial moment when Kade had offered help to a stranded stranger and changed both their lives forever. As they moved into their 60s, Florence and Kade settled into a comfortable rhythm. Their children were grown and successful, their grandchildren were thriving, and the ranch continued to prosper under Thomas's management. They spent their days working in Florence's gardens, taking gentle rides around the ranch, and sitting on the porch in the evenings just as they had always done. On a perfect spring morning in 1905, Florence woke early and lay in bed watching Kade sleep beside her. His dark hair was now mostly silver, his face lined from years of sun and wind, but to her, he was still the kind cowboy who had offered help to a desperate woman in a dusty Colorado town. She thought about the journey they had traveled together, all the moments that had brought them to this place. Kade's eyes opened, and he smiled when he saw her watching him. "Good morning. What are you thinking about so seriously?" about how grateful I am. For you, for our life, for everything we have built together. I never imagined I could be this happy, this content. You gave me that, Kade. You saved me that day in Loveland, not just from being stranded, but from a life that was all wrong for me. You saved me too, you know. I was half alive before you came, just going through the motions. You brought music and laughter and love into this house, into my life. Everything good came from that moment when the stage left you behind. He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers just as he had done thousands of times before. They rose and went about their morning routine, comfortable in the patterns they had established over decades together. As Florence made coffee and Kade went out to check on the horses, she thought about how her life had turned out so differently from anything she had imagined in her Philadelphia theater days. She had thought success meant applause and acclaim, standing on a stage before hundreds of people. Now she knew that real success was this: a quiet morning in a home filled with love, a partnership built on mutual respect and affection, a legacy of children and grandchildren and lives touched through generosity. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountains, Florence began to sing. It was not a formal performance, just a simple melody that came to her in the moment, words about journeys and homecomings and love that endures. Kade listened with his eyes closed, a slight smile on his face, his hand holding hers. When the song ended, they sat in companionable silence as the stars emerged overhead. The creek burbled in the distance, horses whinnied softly in the pasture, and a cool breeze carried the scent of pine from the mountains. Florence looked around at the ranch they had built together, at the life they had created from that chance meeting so many years ago, and felt completely at peace. "The stage left me with you," she said again, the phrase that had become their private touchstone over the years. Kade pulled her closer, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "And I will thank that stage every day for the rest of my life." They remained there until full dark, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful and lasting. Their love story had started with a broken-down stage company and a cowboy's kindness, had grown through challenges and triumphs, and had blossomed into a life rich with meaning and connection. It was not the life Florence had planned or imagined, but it was infinitely better than anything she could have dreamed. As they finally rose to go inside, Florence took one last look at the mountains silhouetted against the star-filled sky. She thought about the frightened young woman who had stepped off a stage in Loveland 27 years ago, lost and uncertain about her future. If she could go back and speak to that woman, she would tell her not to be afraid, that the best years of her life were just beginning, that the seeming disaster of the stage company folding was actually the best thing that could have happened. But she did not need to go back. She just needed to keep moving forward, cherishing each day with the man who had become her partner, her love, her home. The stage had left her behind, but in doing so, it had given her everything she never knew she needed. And that, Florence thought as she walked into the warmth of the house with Kade's hand in hers, was the greatest gift of all.